just then, a heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon, so that we were again in darkness. When I could see again, the driver was climbing in, and the wolves had disappeared. This was all so strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me, and I was afraid to speak or move. The time seemed interminable as we swept on our way, now in almost complete darkness, for the rolling clouds obscured the moon. Suddenly I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast ruined castle, from whose tall windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky.
That was Jonathan Harker's first sight of Dracula's castle. And it comes from a book written by a man who had never been in Transylvania in his life. A man who was born not in some crumbling ruin surrounded by howling wolves, but in the respectable Dublin suburb of Clontarf. That man was Abraham Stoker, known to his family and friends, and now to all the world as Bram. Bram Stoker was the son of a civil servant who worked in Dublin Castle and was born at 15, the Crescent, Clontarf. And the house is still there, on November the 8th, 1847. He was a rather sickly child who grew into a big, hulking lad, so that when he went to Trinity College, he swept the board when it came to the athletic side of things. He played for the first 15 at rugby football, and he won cups and medals for walking and weightlifting. He was pretty good at his books too, graduating with honours in science in 1870. And he was popular with both the students and the professors. A man like that, you might think, starting off with all the advantages, would have the world at his feet. But that's not always the way it works out. Bram found himself a clerk in Dublin Castle, following in his father's footsteps, and was soon working on a book which was about as different from Dracula as you can imagine. It was called Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in Ireland. The duties certainly didn't include tracking down vampires. One of Bram's interests, however, which had very little to do with the dusty offices of Dublin Castle, was the theatre. At this time, touring companies, mostly from Britain, were very popular in Ireland. The leading actors became as well known as a pop star does today. One of these actors, a man who was often seen on the Dublin stage, was the famous Henry Irving. And to young Bram Stoker, he was the greatest.
What I saw, to my amazement and delight, was a patrician figure, as real as the person of one's dreams, and endowed with the same poetic grace. A young soldier, handsome, distinguished, self-dependent, compact of grace and slumberous energy, a man of quality who stood out from his surroundings as a being of another special world, a figure full of dash and fine irony, and whose ridicule seemed to bite, buoyant with the joy of life, self-conscious, of supreme and unsurpassable insolence, veiled and shrouded in his fine quality of manner.
That's what you might call a rave notice in theatrical terms. And Bram was so carried away by his hero that he went off to the Dublin Mail, a newspaper of the time, and offered to write dramatic criticism for nothing, since it was quickly pointed out to him that the paper couldn't afford to pay. So in 1871 he began his second career, not only attending the theatre as often as he could and writing up the performances, but turning his attention to other kinds of writing, besides the duties of the clerks of petty sessions. Shortly after he left Trinity, a book appeared by a fellow Dubliner, Sheridan Le Fanu, called Carmilla. Its theme was vampires, and it had a big influence on Bram Stoker. Not long after, he wrote his first horror story called The Chain of Destiny. But it was the theatre at this time that interested him most, and Henry Irving in particular. In 1876, when the actor was back in Dublin playing Hamlet at the Theatre Royal, he read Bram's review of his performance and asked to meet him. The two of them hit it off immediately. The following year, when Irving was again in Dublin, he suggested that Bram might consider joining his theatrical company, not as an actor, but as business manager. Irving was in Dublin again in 1878, and the idea was discussed further. In September of that year, Bram received a telegram from the actor in Birmingham, asking him to come over and discuss important business. The business was that Irving had taken a lease on the Lyceum Theatre in London and wanted Bram Stoker to become his acting manager. Bram agreed without a second thought, resigned from the civil service, and delaying only to get married. The girl he married had been thinking of marrying Oscar Wilde instead, left Ireland for the hurly-burly of London theatrical life.